today at the lovely Hallcroft fishery. It's a very popular fishery through winter. However, as you can expect, now that the water's getting a little bit colder, the fish generally tend to change the way that they're feeding, and that's where we need to look at the different approaches just to keep trying to put more fish in our net. So that's why I'm here today. I'm here today to just show you a few tips and tricks to help you catch more fish through winter. Now it's getting colder, and some of the tweaks that we actually put in place where we are doing things slightly different from what we will be doing through the warmer parts of the year. So I really hope you're going to find some of these tips and tricks helpful, and we're hoping they're going to help you put a few more fish on the bank this winter. When we start getting into winter, the water temperature is obviously going colder, and the colder that goes, it basically means that the fish slow down. So if they're not moving about as much, they don't need to eat as much, and that's why we generally tend not to feed as much in winter. And that is the time when we start looking at the groundbait choices that we are thinking of using. What you've got to remember is, and lots of people kind of overlook the fact that in many cases fish actually eat groundbait. You know, we obviously want them to eat the freebies that we're introducing through the groundbait. So it might be your maggots, your casters, your pinkies, but they do eat the groundbait. So you don't actually want the fish to be filling up on groundbait, do you? You want the fish to be eating the freebies that you're giving them, and ultimately picking out your hook bait as well. So that is why in winter we tend to change the types of mixes that we use, and we tend to go down a much finer mix route. Okay, now there are loads out there on the market. The one that I've used a lot over the last 12 months is F1 green. Now obviously anything generally with the word or the name F1 on there generally gives you an idea of what it's like. It tends to be a finer mix, and sometimes in most cases a darker mix as well. So just to briefly talk about why I select a mix like this in winter, the first thing is it's a really fine mix. So that basically means that there isn't loads and loads of feed in there, there isn't loads of pellets in there. Some mixes have got lots of food value in them, and particularly some of the coarser mixes, and that's not something, you know, we don't want that in winter. We want a nice fine mix. So that's why we go down a finer mix route, so there's less food actually being introduced through the groundbait. And the other thing as well is we tend to go for darker mixes, and that's generally because we generally find that fish in clearer water, which is what we're often faced with in winter, fish feed a little bit more confidently over darker coloured mixes. So generally, the clearer the water, the darker the mix. Simple as that. That is our general guideline. Okay, this is a dark green mix, which I've got loads of confidence in. It's very fashionable as well. It's a very common colour now. But as the water gets clearer and clearer, I will even go down an even darker route than this. Okay, so it's a super fine mix, this one. Whether you mix it the night before, you mix it on the morning, it doesn't matter. For me, I always put it through a sieve. I always sieve the mix. No matter what mix it is, I always put it through a sieve. And that's because when you're mixing your groundbait, you're all going to have lumps in there. The lumps in there don't want thrown away. Basically, those lumps are just bits of groundbait that have absorbed more water than some of the others. And I want that water that I've introduced to the mix to be distributed evenly throughout the mix, so that you haven't got any lumps in there, because those lumps could potentially be eaten by the fish, you know. And if you've got quite large lumps of groundbait, what you're actually introducing, a fish might only take one of those lumps, and that might be it for the day. It might not feed again. So we want the mix to be nice and fine. So I always use the finest mix, which is a 3mm mesh. Okay, so I always put it through there first, put my mix there, and just push it through a nice sieve like this. Push it through, and as you can see there, we end up with a super fine mix. It's really fine. That's not going to fill the fish up too much. Okay. Having said that, every mix that you get out there is going to have some element of feed in it, and it's not uncommon now for anglers to actually try and take some of that feed out if they think it's going to be super hard, or if they're only fishing for 1 or 2 bites, you know, which is, unfortunately, it's quite common through winter depending on the venues that you're going to. So you might want to take a little bit of feed out of this. It's dead easy to do it, and if you do it this way, it will also open your eyes as to how much feed is actually in a mix like this. I've already said it's super fine, but there is feed in there. So all we can simply do to take that feed out is simply tip that on there, and by sieving it really quickly and then stopping there, you can see how much food is actually in that mix. To the naked eye, or looking through the window on the bag, you couldn't see how much food was actually in there. So by doing that, basically I can take that out. If I don't want to introduce all that feed, I could just use this super fine mix here. And you could do that 2 or 3 times and get as much out of there as you can. It's just a great way of tailor making your mix to suit the situation that you're faced with. And it just gives you a little bit more flexibility. And you know, as we've always said with ground baits, whatever you need to do to your mix that's going to give you that confidence, then that's the key. Groundbait choice is always down to confidence. And this is just a great way of just trying to make sure that if there are only a few fish in front of you, that the few fish that are there are going to end up getting your hook bait. One of the things that we do in summer is it's quite common to put a bomb on and have a cast around your swim. You know, you might be looking for gravel, looking for features. In winter, however, especially when it goes really cold, that is something that I do my very best to avoid. We know that fish ball up in winter. They might be in certain areas of your swim. And when it's cold, when they're not moving, the last thing you want to be doing is putting a bomb on and casting it all over your peg before the start of the session, because that is inevitably, it's only going to spook fish out of your swim. So if you are fortunate enough to draw on a few fish, the last thing you want to do is go spooking them before the match has even started. So just be very thoughtful about where you're going to start your session. Try not to spoil your swim before you even get going. And if you have got to search your swim throughout the session, just try and do it gradually. Start shorter and work your way longer. It's just about thinking what the next step is actually going to be. When we are feeder fishing, there are loads of different feeder rests to choose from, and as you can imagine, they're all designed in a different way for a particular reason. Now, right the way through summer, that is probably the most common style feeder rest that I use, and that is basically because I'm generally fishing a little bit more active. I've got the rod on my knee or across my knee, because obviously you want to pick up on bites quickly, and this is the perfect type of feeder rest to use, and that's why I generally use that all the way through the summer, because you can position the rod in different places. When you get a bite, there's nothing there for the rod to go or the line to get caught on. It's just a really good all-rounder. However, when we're fishing commercial fisheries, quite often you might find yourself fishing a couple of different ways with a feeder, and through the winter it is quite common on some of the venues that I fish, particularly through the competitions that I fish all over the country, where you might have a cage feeder set up, you know, an approach or a rig like that, that's just basically for catching anything, where you fish with maggots and pinkies. But then there might be times during that session when you're targeting carp or F1s with a method feeder, and as you can imagine, those are two completely different ways of fishing. So I don't really want to be using a feeder rest like that when I'm method feeder fishing, because as we all know, it's a self-hooking way of fishing. When you put the rod down, obviously some of the bites can be violent, and that is a very common way of losing your rod, and I don't want that, obviously. So that is why when I fish in winter with multiple different ways of fishing, like a cage feeder and a method feeder, I use that style feeder rest. And that is basically because this gives me the best of both worlds. I've got loads of room there to position my cage feeder rod, whichever way I want to put it there. I turn that end down, so this is the end that is to my left, and that is basically because if I'm fishing with the rod on my knee and I'm striking at every single indication with maggots and pinkies for skimmers or roach, then it means I can strike and there's nothing there for the line to get caught on, and it's just a really useful feeder rest for fishing that way. However, when I put that rod down and I pick up the method feeder, I can still use this rest because it's got an end on it, and that basically means that when I cast the method feeder out, I put the rod down. When I'm method feeder fishing, I don't put the rod across my knee. I'll put the butt of the rod on a butt rest, put the rod down, and then when I do get a bite or hook a carp, the rod can move, obviously, but it can only go as far as that stopper. So that means that I'm not going to lose my rod, and it just means that, you know, you're not afraid to turn around and pour a cup of coffee out like you do in winter to keep yourself nice and warm. It means that even if you do get a savage take or a savage bite whilst you're doing that, it does mean that you're not going to lose your rod. And the final bit to that as well is, again, just making sure that you're not going to go losing any tackle, and that is to use a butt grip. And that is basically for the butt of the rod. This actually flexes, so when you put your rod into that, your rod actually sits in it, and this grips the butt of the rod. It's just an extra insurance policy that when you do pull that method feeder out and you get that big pull, it just means that you're not going to go losing your rod, and it just means that you're a bit more relaxed, and it means that hopefully you're not going to lose any fish, and more importantly, you're not going to go losing your rod as well. So by carrying something like that, it's just really flexible, and it just suits the different styles of feeder fishing that we do on commercials through winter. We all know that fishing in winter, generally the bites can be a little bit more sensitive, you know, the fish are that little bit shyer, they're not moving about as much, and they're not always picking the bait up and then swimming out of the peg so you're getting a great bite. Sometimes they're really tiny little indications. So because of that, when we're feeder fishing, particularly for silverfish, we try and fish with the lightest tip that we can get away with, and that's why it's important to carry a selection. Now, there are loads of different sizes and strengths of tips out there. For me, I carry them in a nice protective tip sleeve like this one, and I store mine upside down. So basically the tips go in that way, and that is because all these tips here are marked at this end with exactly what strength they are, and it just makes it much easier to pick the right one out. So the general guideline is basically fish with a tip that is as light as you can get away with, because that's just going to help show those tiny little indications. And if you're not too sure about which tip to select, one of the little tricks that I always do, if I'm on a venue where I'm a little bit, you know, I'm not quite sure what strength tip I can get away with, because obviously you might have the wind blowing, there might be tow on there, and all that will affect how your tip is going to be set. One of the things that I do is when I get to my peg, when I've set my box up, I pick the rod up that I'm going to use, and I clip a bomb on, and I cast the bomb out to where I expect to be fishing. By doing that, I can put the rod down, and whilst I'm setting my side trays up and stuff, I can have a look at the tip. If the tip's bent right round, it's obviously telling me that there's more tow there than expected, and that means that I can reel that in and quickly change the tip. It means that if I have got to change the tip, and there's a little bit more tow than expected, it means I'm finding that out as soon as I get to my peg. You don't want to be finding that out as soon as the match starts, and you find out first cast, you cast out, the tip goes like that, and then you've got a bit of downtime in the match then because you've got to mess about changing your tip. That's the best time to find out. So that's why we carry a selection of tips. So as a general rule, try and get away with a lighter tip as possible, but if you've got to step it up, you've got to step it up, and that's why we carry a selection. One of the things in winter that can get you those extra few bites is obviously our bait selection, and for me, I think a lot of it is just the way I've been brought up. You know, pretty much a northern lad, old school, growing up on the reservoirs and canals and things. I was always taught never ever to go fishing through winter without pinkies. I didn't realise until recently that certainly fluorescent pinkies, I don't know if it's a little bit of a regional thing. I've spoken to a few people from other parts of the country and they don't use them as much, or they're not aware of them as much as what we are here in the north. But it's a bait that I'll always have with me in winter. Certainly when you're targeting silverfish, you can obviously, there are days when you can catch carp on these as well through winter. But the fact that they're riddling can be the key, you know. Through summer, we obviously spend a lot of time fishing with dead red maggots or dead reds, dead pinkies, that sort of thing. So we're fishing for bream, and you want a bait that's a little bit inert, you know. But we have proven time and time again that a riddling bait can attract the attentions of small fish. But even in winter, it can actually be the best way to go for bigger fish as well. Obviously, a moving bait through winter can just entice you those extra few bites, and it's something that I've only really seen make a huge difference over the last couple of years when I've actually gone out and experimented between dead baits and live baits. The live baits, certainly on certain venues, have really caught me some extra fish. The reason why we go down the pinky route is obviously, as you can see, these are fluorescent pinkies. The colour is one thing, you know, particularly in clearer water as well. It's a really high visual bait. The fish can pick it out really easily, just like fishing with a grain of corn, you know. It stands out on the bottom as well, and I think sometimes, particularly if the fish are up in the water, it gives the fish something nice and bright to go down to go and have a look at. And obviously when you're feeder fishing, that is where your bait and your hook bait is. So if you can get fish to go down on the bottom, then that's going to make them easier to catch. The fact that they're riddling will get you those extra bites, and because these are smaller than maggots, You can fish with 2 on a nice, you can even fish with 2 of these on a size 18 hook if you have got a scale down, or a size 16 hook, matched perfectly with double pinky. But it's also a great bait for tipping off other baits as well. Say if you are catching on with a red maggot, for example, or dead red maggot, you can actually just cap off your hook bait with a lovely fluorescent pinky, and it's amazing how sometimes you just do something like that and it can transform your swim completely. And because these are smaller than maggots as well, they're not going to fill the fish up as much, you know, so they can eat more of these without filling up too quickly. But the fact that they're moving, the fact that they are alive is the key thing for me in winter. And it's one of those baits where sometimes it might not make much difference, but on those really, really hard days, these have been proven to catch you those extra fish. Well, we really hope that you found some of these little tricks helpful, and we really hope that it's going to help you catch a few more fish this winter. We've all got our own little things that we do in winter to just try and catch those extra few fish. So if you'd like to share with us some of your top tips for winter, please comment below and let us know what they are. It's been a really interesting session. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to see more videos from this channel. So thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.